Hello and welcome to UK Column News. It's Friday the 17th of April 2015, just after 1 o'clock. And I'm in the studio on my own today. Thankfully, though, I'm joined by David Scott from north of the border. And so I'm just going to say straight away, hello, David. How are things?
Things are fine in sunny Perth once again. And I'm very impressed you're managing to do, I think, 3 jobs with only 2 hands. Quite impressive.
It's the magic of technology when it works, and hopefully it will work smoothly today, and no dropped lines and so on. Well, the weather here is pretty rubbish. We've got grey skies, a bit of spitting rain. Around the country it looks quite similar. Some people talking about blue skies, but not too many. How are things up there?
It's very nice. We've got blue sky. We've got some sunshine. It's a nice spring day, and yeah, you can feel quite optimistic till you look at the papers, that is, or how the judiciary and the government works. But it's better to look at nature.
Well, indeed, and you wanted to start off with this article. So Scotland has gone mad, and it seems that since the referendum, at least north of the border, the nationalist movement seems to be becoming more extreme. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I mean, I like to strip half naked and paint myself blue as much as the next man, but I do find that I feel myself a little bit of a stranger in my own country, and a lot of people share that same view. This is an article by the columnist of the year in Scotland, Chris Deerin, Telegraph Media Group, and he comments that, I'll just read a couple of paragraphs here, the pro-independence yes campaign was a deliberately vague, intentionally slippery, Pollyannish affair that treated voters like infants and offered an unforgivably shoddy prospectus on which to base the creation of a new state. That is very true. He goes on, it was a case built on empty assertions and shifting goalposts rather than hard facts and considered projections. In September, the oil price estimates used by the oil economist Salmond as the underpinning for the financial calculations have fallen away by more than half, but still there is no humility to be found. As journalist Bruce Anderson wrote at the weekend, the Scottish Enlightenment represented the triumph of rationalism, always in a calm and restrained fashion. Its philosophers and economists believed in using reason to improve the human condition, not to reshape human nature. A separatist movement isn't violent, thank goodness, although we may come to that. But it is bluntly dumb, faith-based and irrational and unenlightened. Increasingly, it feels like dragging all of Scotland down to its level. What, I wonder, would Adam Smith or David Hume make of what has become of the once world-beating little nation? So while you could argue that some of the philosophy of Hume was a bit of a disaster, the basic thrust of this is correct, that we have an irrational approach to politics, to the economy, and increasingly an intemperate approach to our fellow man. And the tendency of this current Scottish government and the current Scottish civil service to view the role in life as one of improving, changing the nature of human nature, and moulding the population of Scotland as though it was a product or some sort of clay to be shaped by our glorious leaders, is a very worrying and unwise and ultimately totalitarian step. And that's what we're seeing round about us. It's a very strange time in Scotland.
And anyway, who's driving this? Is this being driven by the Scottish Nationalist Party, or is it being driven through the media, by some other interest group, or what? Who is actually pushing this nationalism in this way, this form of nationalism?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think it's an assembly of vested interests. It's a corporate state as it was perhaps developed in 20s and 30s Italy. It's a case of there's a number of vested interests that have come together. They see it as in their short-term self-interest to proceed in this way, and that they are doing. We have a political discourse which for for a long time has been devoid of any proper economic analysis, and also devoid of any proper voice calling for freedom and liberty. So the discourse in Scotland has been very much dominated by various brands, national and international, of socialism, often quite hardline socialism, that has been able to ignore the consequences of the policies, because the consequences could either be covered by the greater British government and state or blamed on it.
So how does that all fit in with this article from the Scotsman then?
Yes, Alan Massey's pointing out here that there's a tendency now for some aspects of the nationalist movement in Scotland to view anybody who disagrees as traitorous, and you're getting, certainly on Twitter, and the term cybernats, the unofficial and very outspoken pro-nationalist voice in Scotland tends to target any comment from south of the border, and make it clear that they view it as unjustified or irrelevant simply because it's from south of the border, irrespective of the quality of the analysis or the quality of the comment. And they also view Scots who want to remain part of Britain as somehow traitorous or less Scottish or less patriotic, much to the annoyance of the majority of Scots who feel just that way.
Okay. And sorry, I'm just struggling here a little bit. Sorry, David.
I'm not surprised, actually. I think you're doing a fine job given the limited resources you have.
Yeah, I'm just out of a little bit of practice of running this whole, running everything myself. So, but obviously this is spilling over into some pretty unpleasant activity.
Yes, this was the Conservative and Unionist Party election office in Aberdeen. Not the first time Unionist Party offices in Aberdeen have had this type of graffiti placed on their doors and windows. Almost identical vandalism took place several years ago. You see there's a swastika, the word scum.
But they couldn't get their swastika right?
Yeah, it's a back to front swastika. I'm not quite sure as to whether that's intentional or not. And the letter Q, Q stands for Quisling. So what they're trying to do here is paint, in this case, the Conservatives, but the same allegations are placed against the Labour Party, maybe less often, but it also happens to Labour Party candidates. Paint them as basically the 1940s Norwegian government under Quisling. Now that was a nationalist government who was content to have a degree of local autonomy under a Central European power, namely Germany.
Yeah.
Which is, I would have to point out, more akin to the SNP policy with regards the European Union than it is perhaps either the Conservative or the Labour Party. I mean, calling Scottish Conservatives or Scottish Labour candidates Quislings doesn't have really any validity. You can criticise these people on many things, but they don't really share very much of the belief structure of Quisling. So it's simply abuse and name calling and trying to paint anything that is not nationalist as somehow anti-patriotic, anti-Scottish, and in some regards a betrayal. And that obviously makes for a very intemperate discourse, not a proper sharing of ideas, and a more divided nation than I can ever remember.
But I mean, is there any discussion amongst the nationalist movement and this move towards nationalism? Is there any discussion of the European Union and whether actually the nationalist aim for independence would result in any kind of genuine independence? Is that even part of the discussion?
Not anymore. There was a discussion on that many years ago. The SNP of pre-1979 era was quite a different animal. They were, for example, they wanted to be out of NATO, and they saw NATO and foreign entanglements as a negative. And they wanted to be out of the European Union because they saw rule from afar, be it London or Brussels, as a negative. And they wanted to have independence with the greatest degree of self-control and autonomy under a parliamentary system that they could. So the idea was originally, SNP policy was to leave Europe. Now that was jettisoned when Salmond took over the party, and it moved dramatically to the left. It adopted this independence within the European Union policy, although you could argue as to how much that's oxymoronic or how much it actually means, but that's the policy. Now, this was partly a political move because many people in Scotland viewed independence and say, well, what, do we need a passport to go to England? But my sister lives in England. We don't want that. Why would that help us? So the European Union allowed some of those arguments to be circumvented, because you could argue that really we're all still in one union, kind of, and it's a bigger union, but we have more independence. But of course, with so many of the laws originating in European directives, you could argue that the independence was perhaps more apparent than real.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, we'll move on then. We'll move on to the sad subject of paedophilia, which still inhabits the news because apparently everybody is being protected quite openly these days. We've got Lord Janner, of course, but here we've got the Press and Journal pointing out that Aberdeen men who downloaded child porn have avoided jail. Is this anything more than a judge protecting his friends, or what's this story about?
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily a judge's friends. What it is an Aberdeen sheriff, a sheriff called Graham Buchanan, was presiding over this case. The two men were found guilty. What's termed child pornography, we must remember, is simply child abuse, it's child rape.
Right.
Pornography, bad as it is, actually is too nice a word
to
describe what these people are looking at and buying into and economically promoting.
Can I clarify, Graham Buchanan? That name seems familiar.
It may well be familiar to many of you.
Right. So okay, and so he's what are the grounds for not putting these men in prison then?
He felt that the appropriate sentence was 250 hours of community service. You may recall that that's exactly the same sentence that Robert Greene received for campaigning and blogging and discussing the Holly Gregg case, and for speaking out about the Holly Gregg case. And he was recently convicted and sentenced to exactly the same amount of community service in order that he would end his campaign.
Not that it particularly matters, because any amount of child porn is too much, but what was the scale of the offence in this case?
It was thousands of images and hundreds of videos. It was quite substantial. It wasn't maybe one of the largest hauls, but it was substantial. It wasn't one or two instances or one or two pictures or someone being a bit curious. It was substantial amounts of material running to thousands of photographs, hundreds of videos, downloaded over many months.
Spectacular. So that's it's a bit rhetorical, but how many times does this type of thing have to happen before people actually find it unacceptable?
Well, indeed, and to what extent are those people now going to be a risk to the communities? To what extent has that risk been properly considered? To what extent is the tendency of many of these crimes either to be not prosecuted because it's not in the public interest, as we've seen this week with Greville Janner. It's been deemed not in the public interest, despite it would appear a very substantial amount of evidence against him, direct witness testimony from multiple victims, concerning. I think I'll take it all. It will be dozens, if not hundreds, of actual instances of abuse. It's not in the public interest to prosecute. So we're seeing that, and we're seeing where some people end up in court and they're treated very leniently, and other people, particularly people like Robert Greene, people like Melanie Shaw, who are blowing the whistle on these crimes, they end up in court and it's anything but lenient. In fact, they get the most severe punishment possible. It seems to be far from just.
Indeed, and as we pointed out a couple of days ago, the Conservative Party, manifesto makes the claim that they will protect victims and whistleblowers. The actions of the authorities, time and time again, demonstrates the emptiness of those words, I think. But this morning on Channel 5, actually, there was a phone-in discussion about Lord Janner, and the Channel 5, the person presenting the programme was absolutely pushing the notion that it's totally unfair to prosecute somebody who is ill with Alzheimer's, particularly when they may be innocent, is the view that was being pushed forward. I mean, do you have a view on Janner? Let's assume for a second he does have the illness that they claim that he has. What is your view about somebody who is that ill going in to face any kind of charge? Doesn't really matter what the charge is. And
as I understand it, there's a twin test here. One, is there enough evidence to stand a reasonable probability of a successful prosecution? And the conclusion reached by the DPP is that yes, there is enough evidence. But that doesn't mean he's guilty. Everyone is entitled to their day in court, to a proper defence, to face their accusers. But there's enough evidence to take him to court. The second test is one of public interest. Now, this is a test which is often used to conceal the truth. It's a test that is a bit of a slippery thing. It's very subjective. It's very difficult to pin down. But if it means anything, it must surely mean that there's some sort of proportionality in the judgment that's formed. Is it in the public interest to spend huge sums prosecuting a very sick man for a trivial crime? Is it in the public interest to spend time and money prosecuting a mildly ill man for extremely serious crimes? There must be a comparison. There must be a judgment. Now, how ill is Greville Janner? Well, obviously, I don't know. I've never met Greville Janner. He was getting paid for attending the House of Parliament, and guiding our country and sitting on committees in 2014, which at least gives pause for thought as to, is it possible that he's maybe a little less ill than is being described?
It certainly seems like a pretty rapid decline, doesn't it?
Yes. Now, while that's not impossible, it certainly gives the public cause for concern that this has not been done in the correct manner. And there has been previous on this. Was it something the Guinness family was in court and in jail and was released with Alzheimer's, and it didn't seem to be all that very bad? Was that not? That was back in the 80s, wasn't it, or 90s, a long time ago?
Yes.
But there have been previous cases of medical diagnosis being somewhat less than crystal clear, particularly in something where you're talking about mental decline, and you are toiling as a medic, I would have thought, to objectively diagnose that. It's not something you can put under a microscope and see. You are relying on, to some extent, on responses from an individual.
Yes.
So it may be that it's the sort of thing that can be enhanced or misrepresented.
Yes. Okay. Well, moving on from that, then you wanted to highlight this. It was a video report produced by Channel 4, actually, discussing the Kincora situation. I think you were quite impressed with this article.
Yes, it was very sensitively done. It was very heartfelt. It was following the story of a man who had been abused at the Kincora Boys' Home and at Dolphin Square and by senior politicians and other senior members of the British establishment.
Yeah, he was at Elm House as well, isn't that correct?
He was at Elm House, yes. There's a link here between Dolphin Square, Kincora and Elm House and the Westminster paedophile ring. So in terms of it illustrating the nature of the story, it's very important. But also, it was tackled by Channel 4 extremely well. They let the man tell his own story. They didn't hide the distress that this was causing him, but neither did they revel in it. It was very well judged, and he was taken to see a man who had identified that this abuse was going on when working with the British security services, and had been told to drop it and not to take it any further. And this gentleman felt very badly that he had obeyed that order, and that if he hadn't done that, he might have saved this gentleman and many others a great deal of suffering. And it showed these two gentlemen finding in their mutual support and respect some degree of reconciliation. And it was a very moving piece. And if there's going to be good journalism coming out of British TV media, it tends to be Channel 4 that does it. And this is another example to show that there are some very good people in the mainstream media doing some very good work. It's well worth watching.
Well, I mean, I have to agree with that to a certain degree. Channel 4 does seem to produce some good stuff from time to time. Unfortunately, they also seem to be pushing, for example, transhumanism and certain other agendas that we might not like. But certainly, Channel 4 News of the mainstream media news seems to do about the best job.
Yeah, the bar's not particularly high.
Well, that's true.
Channel 4 is the kind of outstanding player in that.
Okay, and another article that you pointed out was Lord McCluskey here. The article entitled "Corroboration." What was it you wanted to highlight about this?
Well, Lord McCluskey is one of many Scottish law lords who is defending corroboration, which is, of course, a principle which dates back to the Old Testament. That a thing will be established by the testimony of two witnesses, not one.
Yes. Recognizing
that sometimes people make stuff up. And this has been a requirement of Scottish law, Scottish criminal law, for, well, basically ever.
But of course, corroboration doesn't have to come from a second witness. It could come from physical evidence.
That's correct, yes. It would be corroboration in many forms, but yes, corroboration is required. Kenny McCaskill, former Justice Secretary, was very against corroboration. He wanted more convictions, and he didn't seem to have too many concerns regarding the danger of wrongful conviction that came with it. He just wanted more people convicted, and he was moving to get rid of corroboration. And it came unstuck. The judiciary, or at least some parts of the judiciary, stood up against it. Now, Lord McCluskey here is pointing out that Nicola Sturgeon, who is all for getting rid of corroboration, was using that very principle to defend herself against the claim that she had had a quick word with the ambassador from France and had said that Ed Miliband wasn't fit to be Prime Minister, and she would really rather have Cameron, all things considered. And she was using, essentially, corroboration to defend herself from this revelation, which is termed Nicky Leaks in Scotland, and simultaneously arguing against corroboration for people who are accused of much more serious crimes in the courts. So he was pointing out the hypocrisy, that's coming from the top of the SNP in this regard.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Well, let's move on then to Aisha King, because there seems to be more criticism of the parents in this case, and you got to ask
Yes.
why.
This was a very strange piece. It was very one-sided, despite the BBC claiming to be other than that. It interviewed a doctor at the hospital who seems to have learned nothing from the whole process.
Yes.
And it interviewed a nurse who seemed to have learned less than nothing. She didn't seem to have a very clear idea what had been done or why, but was adamant that she would do the same thing again. She was basically stating that if anyone took their child out of the hospital, then they would have a duty, because they, the hospital, would be responsible for whatever happened to that child, which is clearly nonsense. If a parent makes a decision to take a child out of hospital and seek medical attention elsewhere, the responsibility lies with the parent.
Well, that depends on the attitude of the establishment, doesn't it? Because that attitude is changing, as you recognise, I'm quite sure, where they are seeming to claim parental responsibility for children these days. And of course, if that's how you view the world, then that's the kind of statement that you're going to make. On the other hand, we still live in a world where we as parents have parental responsibility for our children, and therefore the decisions are ours and not the hospitals.
Yes, the doctor made a statement which was equally bizarre. He said that the parents couldn't possibly be both the professionals and the carer for the child, when quite clearly they were not trying to do this. They had got specialist medical attention elsewhere within Europe. That was being delivered by professionals. They weren't trying to be professionals and carers. They were trying to just look after their child. They were being guardians and carers, and the name for that is, of course, parent.
Yes.
But this didn't seem to be recognised by anyone in the hospital. So it seems that despite all of the public outrage at the way Aisha King and the King family were treated, that the hospital concerned and the medics concerned and the professionals concerned have not learned anything, and that the assumptions and worldview that promoted the ludicrous sight of Interpol and the entire European police force pursuing this loving family across Europe, handcuffing the parents, separating them from their sick child, all for the crime of trying to seek the best possible medical attention. So having seen that, and then seen that the parents have been proved right, the medical attention has been obtained and has, it would appear, been extremely successful, that the BBC and the hospital concerned think that now is a good time to try and remind everyone of why the hospital and the police and the state and all of the paraphernalia that goes with it were really right after all, and it was in fact the nasty parents who were responsible for the whole ridiculous charade.
Do you think there's a bit of bitterness on the part of the hospital and the authorities that in fact this child does seem to have had such successful treatment elsewhere?
Well, it's a harsh thing to say of anyone that they'd want to see a sick child get worse. But one comment from the doctor, which was particularly troubling, is that the NHS is about fairness. It's about equality. And unless we can give everyone the same medical attention, we can't give anybody that medical attention. That seems to fly in the face of basic medical ethics, as far as I can see.
Well, is this equivalent to No Child Left Behind? So in other words, we all get increasingly worse service because the same level of service can't be provided right across the country? Is that really what he's saying?
It seems to be. It's the lowest common denominator.
Yes.
That if we're in a position where there's 500 people ill and we can save 250, then on the basis that saving 250 and not saving 250 is not fair and equal, we'll let them all die, because it'd be far better to be dead in the knowledge that
you're dead fairly. Yes.
Yeah, you died fairly. Yeah.
That's a staggering situation.
Isn't it?
Okay, well, let's move on to financial stuff quickly. This quite an interesting article here. The most dangerous headline I've seen since 2008. This was the article about the German bank. Isn't that correct?
Yes, this one popped up in my email inbox, and I thought it was very interesting. As here we see a bank failing and having to get bailed out. Now, this is a German bank, and we are assured that Germany is the strong man of the European economy.
But I mean, this is a German bank being bailed out. Of course, that was top BBC billing, right?
Actually, by some fluke, the BBC missed this one.
Oh dear, right.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, none of the British mainstream media are talking about this because, well, you see, the financial crisis is over. I hope you realise this. This is not the eye of the hurricane. Despite the fact that none of the problems which caused the 2008 financial crisis have been diagnosed, let alone cured, despite the fact that, let's say, if you believe that malinvestment is key, none of the malinvestments have actually been corrected and people have just been bailed out, so everything's essentially got worse.
Well, I mean, it's spectacular, isn't it? We've still got companies like CWM who are sponsors of Motor Grand Prix. They're also sponsors of Chelsea Football Club. We have 13 arrests in the last month at that for running a Ponzi scheme, allegedly, of the type of Bernie Madoff. Not quite as big. It's only £20 billion or something like that. And this same the same kind of corruption, the same kind of behaviour is still going on. The authorities not getting to grips with it. It's either not being reported at all, or and being brushed under the carpet, or they're just, or this is actually policy. And in the meantime, as you know, David, the levels of personal debt, corporate debt, and government debt are increasing day by day. And since it was the levels of debt which effectively caused the pre-shock, which was the 2007-2008 crash, we are only getting in a worse situation daily.
Yes, I mean the solution to a debt crisis being to borrow your way to success.
Yes.
is a unique take on things. It is, of course, Nicola Sturgeon and SNP party policy, and party policy of the Green Party and of a few others besides. But it is, of course, monumentally stupid. What's happening when you're borrowing? Right? You're essentially bringing forward consumption now and paying for it later.
Yes.
We are talking mostly about consumption. We're not talking about any legitimate investment.
But without consumption, we have no economy.
Well, the economy is all about total spending, right? We just keep the money flowing, everything will be fine. There's nothing else to it. There's nothing to see here. Just total spending. Yeah, that's the explanation. And we're borrowing money from future generations to consume now. The lack of ethics inherent in that situation is pretty severe, and really the future generations impoverished by this means will have no other recourse other than to default, because the debt won't be able to be paid back. And when the default happens, there's going to be an enormous crash, much bigger than the one we've been through, and nothing's being fixed. It's all extend and pretend, kicking the can down the road. And the fact that the bank, and a German bank at that, is having to be bailed out shows just how weak the system really is.
Yeah.
Despite zero interest rate policies, which is a huge perpetual subsidy to the banking industry.
But of course, it's not just debt that is the problem, because pensions are a huge problem as well. And many people don't appreciate that in this country, pensions are unfunded. So in other words, you've got to have a tax income or borrow the money from private banks in order to pay your pensions, if you're going to pay them at all. And I don't know whether you noticed earlier in the week, I can't remember who it was now, suggesting that pensioners should be going out and doing voluntary work in order to qualify for their state pensions. This is a proposal that's now been made. And so it's pretty clear that there's concern about what's going to happen with pensions in the future. We've got the already rising age of pensionable age, and if you set aside, if you can set aside the national debt at the moment of what is it, about £1.5 trillion. The pensions which are unfunded, the black hole that's there to be filled, and maybe you can tell me how it's going to be filled because I can't work it out, is around £4.5 trillion. So where is that going to come from?
Yes, I mean there's a lot in that. I think we should see if we can get Bernie Madoff to come and run the pensions in the UK, because they are a giant Ponzi scheme, and he is an expert in giant Ponzi schemes, and we maybe need that sort of skill working for us. At least he knew enough not to tell everyone it was a giant Ponzi scheme. It's quite important.
It does seem a bit unfair that he's in prison when George Osborne and David Cameron aren't.
Yes, that does seem particularly harsh, because essentially what they've done is not that different. The one thing on the side of the pensioners is they do have a vote. I would rather, I think, be a pensioner than a bondholder, because when it comes, particularly a foreign bondholder, because when it comes default time, what do you think the government's going to default on first?
Yes.
The foreign bondholders who don't have a vote, or the pensioners who do vote in large numbers? Eventually, I think there'll be trouble with paying even that, because there's going to be they'll be able to guarantee a pension, but they won't be able to guarantee what it will buy. I think that will be ultimately the long-term end point. But before then, we're going to have a lot of difficulties. And of course, if the government does start defaulting on debt, then that's the private sector pensions will hold a great deal of that, and as do the banks. And they're really unable to do that without bringing down all of those systems as well.
Yes.
So we do have a very interconnected system and very little room for manoeuvre from any government without causing an enormous crisis. But the enormous crisis will come sooner or later anyway, because it can't be deferred forever.
Yeah, but of course we don't need to worry, because you may have noticed that all the Bloomberg trading terminals were down for most of the day today, and I think that started last night. And so, of course, they can, at a flick of a switch, just switch the markets off, and everything will be all right then, won't it?
Well, it's worth remembering there were bank holidays in the 1930s. Your banks would just close, and you couldn't get at your money, or you could only get at your money at a very limited rate, a la Cyprus, until the government decided to restart the banking system. The one thing I would suggest to people is that they can hold some cash outside the banking system. They should do it, because it will give them a little bit of leeway if any of these events come around again.
But we're not allowed cash anymore, are we? Because at least that's what the continuing pressure is. And I mean, you're highlighting this article from LewRockwell.com, top banker economist issue report advising abolishment of cash. We did briefly mention this a couple of days ago, but I wanted to include this again today because, for example, the Louisiana state legislature has just passed a law which says that if you want to trade in second-hand goods, you may not use cash anymore. You must put it through either a check account or an electronic transfer of some kind. And of course, the argument is that it's in order to avoid money laundering. I don't think the processing of the trading of second-hand goods in Louisiana is the biggest source of money laundering on the planet. Perhaps we should look more towards the big banks, particularly HSBC. But you know, the moves to remove cash from circulation in order to save the economy, the financial system, is the main argument here. Because once everything is electronic, it's much easier to save the financial system. And maybe you can tell me how that works.
It works at the expense of the individual, not surprisingly. Here's the deal. We've got zero interest rates, so you don't really get anything for holding your money in the banks. But that's not enough. We really need negative interest rates. But negative interest rates are very difficult, because if the bank starts saying, well, you deposit £100, we'll give you 95 back in a year, people will start to say, well, I'll just keep my £100, thank you very much, and I'll put it under the mattress, and then I'll have £100 in a year. So the only way to stop them doing this, one of very few ways to stop them doing it, is to eliminate cash money. So there's no means of keeping any sort of valuable resource outside of the banking system. and outside of the ability of regulators, banks, governments, and other interest parties to manipulate it and at their whim reduce it. So it's a big attack on individual liberty. Paper money is not maybe the most ideal form of defending wealth over the peace, because it can be printed up by governments. But electronic zeros and ones are even worse.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, well, look, just to finish off then, David, we have this graph here, which, when we've just been talking about government debt, it seems to pretty much reflect the overall UK situation. But really, can Nicola Sturgeon afford this debt? The answer to that clearly is no, but she doesn't get it. What in this coming election, obviously the SNP is going to do very, very well, but their economic policies seem to be some of the most insane that are on the go at the moment. Is that, or am I being unfair?
No, you're being very fair, but they don't have any comeback on this, because they get essentially a block grant from Westminster, and they just have to spend that. They hadn't even managed to do that. There was actually quite a big surplus in Scotland last year, quite a lot of money they didn't manage to get through. But they don't have. In theory, they've got tax varying powers, and they are trying to gather information on all Scots so that they can identify who is sufficiently Scottish to tax. They haven't quite got there yet, and they're very frightened to use their tax varying powers, because there'll be a big backlash, and a lot of people will try and move just across the border. So they are so far not actually raising any of their own tax, so they don't really have to worry about the realities of the story they're selling to the public. They just want the votes. Vote for us, we'll basically abolish scarcity. That seems to be the line, and they won't, but they might get a lot of votes in the meantime.
Yeah, but I mean, abolishing scarcity is easy. You just print more money, right?
Yeah, printing lots of bits of green paper with the Queen's face on it is a well-known way of making everybody richer, yeah. Yes.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much, David, for joining us once again, and hopefully we'll see you next Friday. Thanks, everyone, for watching, and hope you all have a good weekend. We'll be back on Monday, and hopefully I will be joined by somebody else in the studio. Thanks very much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.